You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. My guest this week is bestselling author Barbara Davis, who has, astonishingly, written 9 books in the past 10 years. She's a beautiful writer of complicated women and their familial relationships. Her latest novel, The Keeper of Happy Endings, builds upon an unlikely friendship in 1984 Boston between 20-something Rory and 60-something Soline, a recluse from war-torn Paris who once created magical wedding dresses. While what unites them initially may be a recognition of similar loss, what unfolds is a friendship that uncovers truths, dispels mysteries, and contains just a little bit of magic. Please allow me to introduce Barbara Davis, author of The Keeper of Happy Endings. Hello, Barbara. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So, can you start off by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
I am Barbara Davis. I am an author of women's fiction. I am currently working on book 9. So I have 8, 7 out in the world. 1 publishes in March, and I'm working on number 9 now. And I think we're here today to talk about The Keeper of Happy Endings, which was number 8.
I was looking through your bibliography. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you produce a book a year. Is that right?
It's pretty close. It's a book a year generally. Occasionally, I'll go 15 months or so, but as a rule, it's a book a year. I've been doing this for 10 years, and I have 9 books. I'm working on the 9th book.
How are you able to be so prolific?
I love what I do, and my last job was so soul-sucking that I am so grateful to have a job that I love and I feel like feeds my creativity, that it doesn't always feel like work. In fact, it rarely feels like work, and I can work 10 to 12 hours a day, just sit here and write, which is not, always healthy, but it's fun.
Yeah, I understand. So can you tell us a little bit about The Keeper of Happy Endings?
The Keeper of Happy Endings is a dual timeline book. So we've got 2 different time frames happening simultaneously that sort of walk toward one another and weave together. We've got 1984 Boston, and then we've got Paris opens on the eve of the Nazi occupation of Paris and the coming of the setup of the Vichy government. So we've got some historical things happening, and then we've got some more contemporary things happening at the same time. It is about the historical protagonist is a young woman who comes from 9 generations of bridal designers, and their bridal shop is very unique in that the dresses they make are very selective. Their clientele is very selective, and the dresses they make guarantee a happy ending for the wearer. The only problem is none of these women have ever managed to have their own happy endings. So it's sort of this dichotomy of that they guarantee happy endings for other people and can't manage it for themselves. So that's the historical component, and this woman will eventually have to leave Paris and come to Boston, where she runs into our contemporary protagonist named Rory, who has been looking for a place to open an art gallery, and she stumbles onto an abandoned row house in Boston that happens to have once belonged to Soline, the seamstress, where these dresses were sold in Boston. And they kind of come together, and their paths collide in ways that that neither one of them can quite understand. There's a connection there that neither one of them can quite figure out. And as the book unfolds, these connections build between these two very unlikely friends.
I loved all of that too. I thought it was so beautifully written, your book.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. And we're going to get into that. But before we do that, can you tell me what is your connection to France or to Paris? Do you have one?
I only in my heart. Love the food, love the wine. Someday I will get there. We actually were planning a trip, our first trip, when COVID happened. So that, of course, went on hold. And we're still waiting because we want to make sure that nothing happens where we get there and one of us gets it and we get sick. And that would just break my heart. So right now, my connection is in my heart. And, I started the book thinking about a bridal designer, and where better to sit a bridal designer than in Paris. So I started doing so much research into the effects of the war and the Vichy government and the occupation, and I just fell in love with the whole culture. So I can't wait to get there and actually walk the streets that I wrote about in the book.
So let me get into these questions. So there are two main characters in the book. We have got Rory, who's the contemporary character that you mentioned. She's in her 20s. And then we've got Soline, who's the more historical woman. She's in her 60s, I believe.
Yes, early 60s.
And so this story is told from both of their perspectives. And in the beginning, we learn more about Rory and the hardships that she's been going through. But then as the story evolves, we learn more about Celine and the hardships she's lived through and how they've shaped her. Is that how it was for you when you were writing these characters? Did it unfold for you the way that it did for us?
Pretty much. Originally, the book was going to be more about a dress that went through 9 generations, and it was almost going to be written from the perspective of the dress.
Oh.
But I needed to start with a character, a designer. So I came up with this family, and I realized that that's where the real emotional arc was what this woman, this one young woman who dreamed of being famous, and all her dreams went out the window when the Vichy took over. They shipped all of the men out of Paris. There were no men. No one was getting married. Wasn't anybody to marry. So her dreams went up in smoke, and then one thing led to another, and it's just this snowball effect. And as I knew these things, they all had to become part of the book. And I could see a way where Rory and Celine were kind of on parallel tracks, just 40 years apart. So I saw Celine becoming almost kind of a mentor to helping Rory navigate some of this roughness, right down to the relationship with her mother and navigating that distance as well.
Were you drawn to the idea of an intergenerational friendship?
I must have been, because I just did it again in the book I wrote. So I was blessed to grow up with both sets of my grandparents and my great grandmother.
Wow.
And in our family, the women were always like the keepers of the flame. They had all of the stories, they had all the traditions. Let's face it, they had all the wisdom. So I think that there's a lot that I was going to say we, the younger generation. I'm the older generation now. I keep forgetting. I think there's a lot that we can gain from interacting with other generations. There's still a lot of lessons to be learned because there's nothing new under the sun. We all go through the same stuff. We don't believe that when we're young, and then when you get older, you have a different perspective. So I like the idea of a young person actually opening up and being willing to learn lessons from someone who's been there.
Yeah, I like that idea too. It pulls us out of our bubbles, which, if we've learned anything over the past few years, that bubble can be quite dangerous.
It can be dangerous for society and personally.
Yeah, absolutely. So you touched on this just a second ago. There are men in the book, but the book is predominantly about the women. And a lot of the book is about relationships between mothers and daughters and expectations and pressures. Why did you decide to concentrate on this dynamic?
I go there a lot, and I think it's because again, it goes back to the women-centric nature of my family. I had my very when I say strong men, I don't necessarily mean that in a good way. I mean that in a misogynistic, overbearing kind of way. And my all of the women in my family found ways to make peace and get done what they needed to get done. There was just an incredible amount of day-to-day wisdom that they had, that they taught me. And I loved being able to bring some of that into the book.
There's a lot of generational trauma in this book as well. It's one of the themes of the book, this idea that our ancestors' traumas or patterns or curses get passed down to us to either repeat or fight against.
Yeah, and I think uh you always say, they always say don't marry your father, don't marry your father. Well, I married my father against all warnings, against better judgment, against my mother who saw it. We tend to repeat the patterns that we see, even though we have been maybe told better. And I think that's until somebody says, well, no, I'm not going to do that. My grandmother married her father, my mother married her and there's been a pattern in my family of us marrying mean, stupid men. And it not just that. I mean, there are tons of different patterns, that we can all fall into. But I think we, automatically we become what we're around. And until we become aware that that's what we're doing and that's where we're headed, and we step on the brakes and say, no, I'm gonna be the one that breaks that mold. I think we just keep doing it. And it may feel like a curse. And that was one of the things that I wanted to bring out in the book, is that all of these women think they're cursed. They can't be happy in love. And it's not so much a curse as it is like a self-fulfilling kind of prophecy, until somebody says, you know what, I'm gonna do it differently. And then you have a new pattern. Then the whole family going forward can have a new pattern.
Yeah, exactly. We live out the stories that are written for us until we're made aware of them.
Right.
Yeah. So Celine comes from a long line of wedding dressmakers, and these women have a magical ability to charm their wedding dresses to ensure long-lasting and happy marriages. I love this idea so much. I love the idea of magic and magic being used in this way, but it does strike me as unusual to set this world where this magic exists in the same world where these Nazis exist. Can you talk a little bit about why you decided to put them in tandem?
I mean, weddings, happy endings, happily ever after, and the whole idea of finding that one all-consuming love is one of the foundations of society, of history. I mean, it's why we perpetuate as a species. Everyone is after that, and it's that dream of being fulfilled. And I couldn't think of anything darker and more non-life affirming than the Nazis marching into this beautiful city of light and just blackening everything. So I liked the contrast, and her finding a way out of that and finding a new way to get back to rise from the ashes, so to speak, and get back to doing her work.
It's it's very interesting. We don't have a lot of firsthand interactions with the Nazis in your book, but they're there in the background, always looming, and they are the impetus for a lot of what happens in the book. And it is nice to have this magic, which is oftentimes a secret, that kind of threads throughout the book. Have you always dreamed of owning a place in Paris? If you're planning on moving, renting, buying, or selling a place in France, you'll need the expert guidance of Gail Boisclair and Marie Pistinier, hosts of the Paris Estate of Mind podcast. Listen now to Paris Estate of Mind on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So to the outside observer, a lot of your characters seem to have it they're very well put together, they've got money, and a lot of them say this about one another. Oh, you're so lucky, you have everything, I've given you everything, even while they themselves are carrying around their own secret traumas and their own secret scars. And it's not until something about the relationship between Rory and Soline, they're able to see past that facade really easily and recognize themselves as kindred souls and come to find out that they are living through a lot of the same situations. And it's difficult for the people around them because they don't want to see beyond the surface. I think there's a lot in your book about forgiveness, but it feels to me a lot about empathy. Do you think that's true?
I do. The relationship between Rory and her mother. Rory's mother was very invested in perfection, in keeping up the appearance. Things that happened in her life that she would gloss over and pretend not to see, and truly sometimes not see, because she didn't if you see it, you have to deal with it. You have to own it. And that there's nothing worse for someone who's putting on this facade of perfection to admit that they're fallible, that they're vulnerable, that they were duped, and that what other people see is purely projection. And that's part of the friction between the Rory and her mother, is that Rory's not about pretending. I'm miserable. This horrible thing has happened to me and I am miserable, and I'm just not going to put on a happy face for you so your friends think everything's fine. And I love the fact that not only does Rory learn to navigate her current traumas and some of her past traumas with her mother, that Rory's mother actually learns too. So there's these three generations of women that kind of are feeding and healing each other at the same time, because Soline does some healing as well. Celine is very closed off at the beginning of the book. No, won't go to the meeting, won't talk to anyone. And then all of a sudden she's doing things and she's spreading her wings. So everyone is healing together, which I really loved, because I think that women are can be wonderful for one another in straightening the crowns and lifting each other up.
It's true. And Celine goes through this too with her own mother who doesn't think she's good enough, or first of all passes down this idea that you'll never be happy in love, and then also says, your work isn't perfect enough, it's not good enough, stop fantasizing about becoming famous. And it's, I guess, having that outside perspective, Celine watching Rory, for example, and with her mother, that somehow allows it to all sort of break apart a little bit.
Right. That first little crack, and then the light gets in, and they little by little they kind of admit their scars and their humanity to one another.
Yeah.
And that allows some healing.
I wanted to ask about the art that you mention in the book as well, because it sounds so amazing. Celine is obviously this really beautiful seamstress, and she creates these magnificent wedding dresses, which were so fun to read about and to picture. But Rory is an artist in a medium that I'd never heard of. Can you talk about that and how you discovered it?
I wanted there to be an artistic link between Rory and Celine, but I didn't want her to make dresses or be in fashion. I wanted there to be a little bit of distance, but I wanted there to still be a tie. And originally she was just going to be a painter. And then I don't know, I don't even know how I knew this was a thing, but somewhere in my travels I must have picked up on the fact that textile art was a thing. And I thought, what if she worked with fabric? She loved fabric and she created with fabric. So I went and I looked to see if such a thing was possible. And there's beautiful work out there, like really amazing stuff. So I started incorporating little bits of art that what I originally had her going to paint, but then I had her do it with fabrics, different fabrics, which was really fun because I got to research a lot of different fabric textures and how they behave, and a lot of techniques with looping and tufting and all that stuff, which it was all new to me. I can't sew a button on, like, really my husband says if a button comes off, he puts it on. I have no skill with a needle whatsoever. So, and people are like, "Oh, how long were you in fashion?" Which I find hilarious. I mean, fashion is shopping for me. That's it. So I love that people think that I can do this thing that I can't begin to do. And the same thing with the art, being able to jump into that and learn about it, but not having to actually produce it other than on paper, is really fun. It takes the pressure off when you don't actually have to, do the thing. But yes, I wanted the connection of the fabric and the sewing. There's still some needle and thread going on, but it's in a different direction.
It's so interesting too, and they use so many different fabrics. Did you know about the different fabrics already, or was that all part of?
Oh, no. Nope. I know this was all research done on the fly because, like I said, I'm a very tactile person. When I shop for clothes or I shop for home, I'm very aware of the textures of fabric. I want a certain feel. I want a certain movement. I don't like stiff stuff. So I had a tactile sense when I read about the fabrics of the ones that I would want to use, but that's as far as it went. It all was learned in the process of doing the book.
It's amazing. I hope I have the chance to see this kind of textual art at some point. Sounds incredible.
It was fun. It was I actually the one picture that's in the window at the restaurant, I would love to have that in my house. I wish someone would actually make that because I would put that on my wall in a minute.
It's the final one that I think I was drawn to with the idea of like the sun peeking out of the clouds and everything.
Mhm.
So beautiful. So I notice that as a writer, you seem drawn to historical fiction, but your last couple of books have woven in a little bit more of this element of magic. What is it about historical fiction that you like so much, and will we see more magic in the future?
Oh, this is such a good question because I just was writing a story for my newsletter about stepping out of our literary comfort zones, both as readers and writers. I cut my teeth as a reader on historical fiction. I loved the Revolutionary War. So I read anything that I could get my hands on and always figured if I ever was lucky enough to write, I would write historical fiction. Well, my first one, two, three, four books were contemporary fiction. So I don't know how that even happened. And then I've always written dual timeline. So there's a historical component, but not in a textbooky kind of way. There's always an older character from the past and a contemporary character that kind of come together. But I haven't brought in history in the past. Happy Endings was the first one that I did with that. And I was afraid that my publisher would push back a little bit and they were like, bring it, we love this story, bring it. So I did that. I started with the magic in my sixth book, which was The Last of the Moon Girls, which was about a family of, again, the women, generations of these herbal healers, and this herb farm that they had. And there was some herbal magic in that. And again, I thought I would get pushback when I pitched that. And they were like, oh my God, we love this idea. So I was like, cool, this is fun. And after writing that book, I had such a warm reception to the magic. I thought, this is something that I want to keep doing. So I wove it into this. I have woven it into my book that is coming out in March, which is called The Echo of Old Books. Takes place in an antique bookstore, in a rare bookstore. And the woman that owns this bookstore has the ability to pick up the emotions by touching a book. She can pick up the emotions of the previous owner of books. And she kind of stumbles onto this literary mystery, two books that appear to be written to talk to one another. It's a man and a woman talking about how their relationship went south and blaming one another. And it's her kind of trying to dissect this mystery. And meanwhile, she's picking up all of these physical vibrations from these books. So again, with the magic, and it weaves so perfectly into that story. And I think all of us right now, especially, could use a little magic, a little sense that there's underneath all of the muck that seems to be happening on the surface, underneath, like there's some magic, some happy stuff working to keep us together. That's right now. I know I could use that.
Yeah, I could use it too. Fabulous. So I'm definitely going to look out for that book. So I think you're going to read a little extract from your book.
Yes.
Is there anything we need to know contextually before you do?
Not really, because I think we're sort of set up on the premise. I'll read from the prologue, which is actually takes place sort of outside of the time frame of the book. It's sort of a promise I make to the reader about what may be coming. And it's in Soline's voice. 13 September 1976, Boston. I have always grieved the ends of things, the final notes of a song as they ebb into silence, the curtain falling at the end of a play, the last snowflake, goodbyes. So many goodbyes. They all seem so long ago now, and yet the collective rawness still chafes. I've had too much wine tonight, I think. It's made me morose, or perhaps I've simply had too much life, too much sadness, too many scars. Still, I find myself drawn to those scars, a map of wounds that takes me neither forward nor back. I've brought the box down from the closet again and laid it on the bed. It isn't heavy in the physical sense, but the memories inside carry a different kind of weight, the kind that sits heavily on the heart. It's made of sturdy stuff, thick gray cardboard with metal fittings at the corners and a heavy cord threaded through as a handle. I hold my breath as I lift the lid and fold back the layers of crumpled tissue to gaze at the dress within. It has aged over the years, like me. The pocket of letters is there too, most in French, a few in English, tied with a length of ribbon. These I will read later, as I do often on nights like this, when the empty places in my life stretch like shadows all around me. There is an order to this ritual of mine, a sequence I never vary. When so much has been uprooted, so many things lost, one must seek comfort in rituals, even the sad ones. I lift out the dress and hold it in my arms, the way one holds a baby or a promise, close and perhaps a little too fiercely. I step to the mirror, and for an instant she looks back at me, the girl I was before Hitler came to Paris, full of hope and naive dreams. But an instant later, she's gone. In her place is the woman I've become, worn and alone, dreamless. My gaze slides back to the box, to the brown leather case lying at the bottom, and I feel my heart squeeze, remembering the first time I saw it. For safekeeping, he said, as he pressed it into my hands on that last morning. I unzipped the case for the 100th time, running my fingers over the tortoiseshell comb and matching shoehorn, the shaving brush and razor. Such personal things. And he'd given them to me. I removed the cut glass flask from the band of its brown elastic, long since empty, and unscrew the cap, yearning for a whiff of the bright, clean scent I've engraved on my memory, a blend of seawater and the peel of fresh limes. Anson. Only this time, for the first time, there is no hint of him. For 30 years, I've been lifting this empty bottle to my nose, taking comfort in the only thing I have left of him, his scent. And now, even that is gone. I wait for tears, but none come. I suppose I'm beyond them now, emptied, and perhaps it's just as well. I return the flask and zip the case closed, my eyes strayed to the packet of letters, usually the final step in my sorry little ritual. I will not read them tonight, or ever again, I think. It's time to let go. Time to let it all go. I return the shaving case to the box, then fold the dress and lay it inside, arranging the sleeves tenderly across the bodice, the way I've seen bodies laid out at funerals. Fitting, I suppose. I caress the fabric one last time, then fold the tissue over it all and lower the lid. Adieu, ensemble, mon amour, c'est la fin. And I apologize for my lack of French pronunciation.
Thank you so much. Does French culture sometimes leave you scratching your head? Well, you might enjoy listening to our sister podcast, Navigating the French, hosted by journalist Emily Monaco. Each episode focuses on a different word in the French language, and Emily is joined by an expert who will help explore what that word says about French culture. Listen now to Navigating the French on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So, what's next for you? I know you have this book coming out in March.
I have the book coming out in March, which I'm very excited about. The hardest book I've ever written, because it's actually like writing. It was actually like writing 3 books, because there's the book, which contains 2 other books within it.
Oh,
So
wow.
it was literally writing 3 books at the same time. So I was pretty sure I lost my mind when I came up with that idea. And I have just begun, within the last 2 weeks, working on book 9, which is called Precious and Fragile Things, which is, again, kind of a mother-daughter story. It's dual timeline about a woman who comes back home after some tragedies in her life, and she stays with her mother and winds up running into a mystery and some secrets that her mother has been keeping, some awful secrets that her mother has been keeping for years from her, and from the world, about who she is, and some things that she has done that have haunted her. So I'm really looking forward to that. This woman, the mother, takes care of terminally ill patients, and when they are gone, it's terminally ill patients that basically have no family. And when they pass away, they leave her all sorts of collections. So her house is full of, she's got this creepy doll collection, and she's got jars full of sand, and she's got silver teaspoons, and this house is just full of all of these precious and fragile things that she feels she has been called to be the keeper of these precious and fragile things.
Amazing. That sounds very interesting too. I love your titles. You have a real knack for book titles.
I I and most of the time I get to keep them. The Echo of Old Books was supposed to be called The Care and Feeding of Old Books, but they were afraid that it wouldn't sound like a fiction title, that people would think it was a, yeah, I don't know how, but anyway. So we tweaked that one, but other than that, I've been pretty lucky with my last 4 to have gotten exactly the title that I came up with, or very close. So Precious and Fragile Things, I hope I will get to keep. It's actually a line from one of my favorite Depeche Mode songs, and I will fight to the death to keep that title.
So where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with you and your upcoming books?
I am on Facebook. I have 2 Facebook pages. One is my personal page, one is my author page. Send me a friend request, or follow me on my personal page, because that's where all the fun stuff happens. That's where I cut up and put recipes and whatever's going on in the world. In my world, it shows up on that page. Or you can find, if you want to find out more about my books, you can go to my author page on Amazon, and read about all of my titles.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And I'll include links to all of that so people can find you really easily.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. It was so wonderful speaking with you.
It has been a pleasure.
Thank you again to Barbara Davis for such a wonderful conversation. You can find Barbara on Facebook at Barbara Davis Author, on Twitter at bdavisauthor, and on her website at barbaradavis-author.com. Please join me next week when I'll be speaking with author Sarah Horowitz about her book, The Red Widow. Check back to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book. Join our book club. The Storytime Book Club welcomes authors who have been featured on this podcast to come talk more in depth about their books. Since we keep the podcast spoiler-free, this is the perfect chance to get all your specific questions answered. Our next guest will be season premiere guest Kate Reardon, discussing her book, The Heat Wave. For more information, including sign-up, please join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. You can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. Thank you for listening, and until next time, happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.